Bienvenue à tous. My name is Emmanuel Kattan. I'm director of the Alliance program. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's event, How Can Europe Promote Social Justice? This debate, part of a 12-event series on the future of Europe, was conceived and created jointly by the European Institute, the Columbia Global Centers Paris, and the Alliance program. I'm delighted and honored to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Ali Aslan. Ali Aslan is an internationally renowned TV presenter and journalist with over 20 years' experience as a talk show host, news anchor, correspondent, and moderator. His journalistic career spans 3 continents and includes work for CNN in Washington, D.C., ABC News in New York, Channel News Asia in Istanbul, and Deutsche Welle TV in Berlin. Aslan regularly moderates at high-level global conferences and has shared the stage with top world leaders including Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau, Christine Lagarde, and Bill Clinton. Last but not least, Ali Aslan is an alum of Columbia University, where he studied international affairs and journalism. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for this very kind and flattering introduction. And indeed, as a proud alum of Columbia University, it's my great pleasure indeed to be hosting and moderating this very timely discussion on the future of Europe, with the focus on the question, how can Europe achieve social justice? And for that, I am delighted to be joined by 4 great speakers, experts, all in their fields in alphabetical order. She's a teaching and research fellow at the European University Institute with a focus on international migration. Welcome to Leila, Hadj, Abdou. Delighted to welcome an associate professor at Columbia's Political Science Department who has written extensively on the state of the European Union, Turkuler Isiksel. Delighted to have with us the research director at Sciences Po Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics, Bruno Palier, and a professor of sociology and political philosophy at my alma mater, Columbia University, Andreas Wimmer. Welcome to the 4 of you. Delighted to have you here and get your take on this very broad, timely, but pertinent issue of social justice, Turku. And let me start with you, because you are based in New York, where the term and the concept of social justice has, next to COVID-19, occupied most of the headlines in the previous weeks and months. Obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement has played an integral part, one that has spilled over to Europe as well. Since you have sort of this bilateral view, both Europe and the US, and how do you think Europe has been impacted by the political developments in the United States, in particular with the focus on the social justice theme?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I guess it's one of the silver linings of our pandemic-stricken age that we're able to get such a diverse group of panelists and also audience members from a lot of disparate places. So that's a consolation. So it used to be that the term social justice would evoke ideas of a more sort of material distributive kind of justice. In other words, sharing the benefits and burdens of a market economy more equitably among different groups and classes in society. There was no particular reason why social justice should have had that connotation, and yet for most of the 20th century, that was the connotation that it had. And what we've seen in the past few months most intensely is a shift towards issues that political theorists, so people in my area of scholarship, have tended to think of as questions of recognition, in particular, recognition and valuation of identities of people or peoples, groups in society who've been oppressed and and excluded from power, as well as from marginalized in the economic and social spheres. So we've seen really a kind of, not that these problems of redistribution and recognition were ever quite, distinct from each other. They were always deeply mutually imbricated, but we've really seen that that imbrication come to a head in the past few months. We're beginning to see a sort of solidarity build up across, what we tend to think of as the West, but also globally as well, and a recognition that these two problems are intimately linked.
Andreas, if we look at, because we have an audience from both the United States and Europe, and when it comes to the issue of social justice, is it fair to say that we Europeans, I'm based in Berlin, Germany, have always felt perhaps, for lack of a better term, a bit superior to the United States? We thought we are more evolved in this particular regard. Do you think that sense is or has been justified at all?
It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you. We're spread all over the different corners of the world. It's great to come together and talk about this important topic. I think, Ali, that's a really good question of whether the sense of that Europe owns social justice and has been better at providing it, at least to large segments of the population. Is that still justified? And I think actually it is, and maybe it is even more than in the past. And I think the COVID crisis has actually brought this to the foreground. And I think in most of the European countries, I mean, Europe is so difficult to talk about Europe, it's so big and there's different countries, and the situation in Finland is just not the same as in Croatia or Iceland and Greece and so on. But let's just go along with it and talk about Europe versus US. So overall, I think the social safety nets of Europe have held actually pretty well during the COVID crisis. The idea of, for example, furloughing people rather than just firing them during an economic downturn has been implemented in a lot of especially the Central and Northern European countries. So I think overall, the social dimension of justice of Europe is shining brighter, although in absolute terms, of course, the situation is still one of crisis and increasing marginality and poverty. But compared to the US, I think the situation is much. The idea of social justice has not come under such a strain as in the US. Or to put this in an image, if I go out, I'm in Los Angeles here, in my neighborhood, there's empty parking lots with food banks, and there's long lines in front of these food banks where people actually who don't have enough food on the table are lining up. Largely immigrant or second generation communities, but not exclusively, as a lot of reporting in the Times has shown. So this you don't see actually to the same degree in Europe. So I think the COVID crisis has actually highlighted some differences in institutional setup and in policy priorities that have existed for a long time.
Very interesting points that you're raising, Andreas. And let me throw it to Leila. You heard Andreas say that, yes, by and large, particularly in times like these, in times of a pandemic, the extensive social safety nets and perhaps social cohesion, as diverse as Europe may be, has held up better comparatively to the United States. Leila, would you agree?
Yes, but I think we also shouldn't only focus on this social dimension. I just looked in the Q&A now, and we had a question by somebody who said, to what extent do you think the term social justice was a concept of the left? And does this maybe explain why we were focused more on economic side of things. I think it's like, also I think the question is justice for whom? And I think this is what we see, what plays out now in these conflicts and in terms of crisis, that justice very much depends on personal values, what we define as just and how we see fairness. And I think this is where the Europe and the United States are very much united in terms of development. So they were rather converging in the sense where we see where political conflicts nowadays go. And that's why it explains lots of the, if you want, the framing of crisis, but also where we are right now in the United States, but also in Europe when it comes to polarization of societies. So I think that's why also I think before the first speaker also mentioned a very important recognition versus redistribution debate. So on the one hand, where we were very much focused on economic redistribution, but then questions of recognition came up much more. And this is the same in the United States as well as in Europe, which new political conflicts where we see, somebody mentioned also Brexit before. So where also these new conflict lines, which are not necessarily along these economic lines anymore, but also other political conflicts which come up. So I think that's why if we focus only on the question of social issues, we don't get the whole picture of the conflicts that are going on in the global north on the whole, and where we have very similar dynamics in the United States and in Europe.
Indeed. And of course, as the discussion will progress, we will go into more detail and bring in more aspects of the social justice debates as it happens in Europe. You've already answered the first question in the chat, which is a very perfect reminder for me to address the audience and say you are, of course, very much encouraged to participate in this debate, not just to listen to it, but enrich it with your questions through the Q&A function. I'll be happy to move it along and bring in your questions as the discussion progresses. Bruno, already Andreas mentioned, of course, when we talk about Europe, we talk about 27 states, countries that in many shape and form couldn't be more different from one another. Do you think it's too ambitious to speak of a European social justice model? Do you think it's not more accurate that one actually has to look at each individual 27 cases?
I think that it really depends to what you compare. You know, for this question, I usually use the metaphor of Google Earth. So if you start with Google Earth with the whole planet, Europe stands out as having one social model, summarized by Angela Merkel saying, you remember, the 5% of the population, 20% of GDP, 55% of the public expenditure, including social spending. So this is pretty common, and we could also say what is common is that there is a public collective guarantee that if you cannot work, you will get an income. If you're sick, you will be treated. When you're old, you will have an income, and we will support your family. So this is common. But as soon as you leave out the other continent, if you wish, and zoom on Europe, then you will see, I'm used to say 5 families of welfare, you know, Nordic countries, liberal countries, continental Europe, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. But as soon as you zoom even closer, you will see huge differences between, for instance, the Visegrad countries and the Baltic countries in Eastern and Central Europe. You will see differences between Portugal and Spain as far as participation of women into the labor market is concerned, differences between Finland, who use much more private actors than in Sweden. So it all depends on the focus. But as I said, what is common is that there is a public guarantees that if you cannot work, lose your job, there will be income, guarantee to access to public education, to public healthcare. This is what is really common and different from many other parts of the world. Of course, you could say that also for Canada, for New Zealand, for Japan, but this is really European in a broad sense.
Then let's zoom in. Let's zoom in now that we have sort of scratched the surface in the beginning and gotten a pretty good overview of what our 4 speakers think of social justice in general and how it compares in particularly to the world and specifically to the United States. Leila, let me bring you in here again, because I know this is a topic where your expertise obviously very much comes into play. Interestingly enough, and one wouldn't think perhaps from the outset, but Europe and even countries like Germany and France are very much criticized by the UN and OECD for the restriction of equitable education, for restricted labor market access for migrants. The OECD states clearly that there is a clear link between the socioeconomic background and the future chances of an individual in one's society. Europe has to do better here, doesn't it?
So yeah, that's a very good question. So you basically speak about the economic integration of migrants and the social mobility. Again, of course, here, I mean, it's diverse. Again, as we said, it's different countries, different welfare models, different labor market access models. So there is no one uniform model, of course. But then again, like when you compare it to the US, I mean, here the philosophy was always integration through economic integration into the labor market. So I think here there are indeed differences when it comes also to the philosophy and how we approach economic integration or integration as such. And then, as I said, like social mobility really depends, and it also depends, there is also where migrants go. I mean, you can also see that migrants, especially who were very much focused also on labor market and labor market mobility, they would tend to go to the United States rather than to Europe, because there the chances were higher in this sense than in some static models where access and social mobility was very hard to achieve. Classic model, for instance, Austria, the country where I'm from, that also has to do with the constitution of companies and like small and middle-sized companies versus like more bigger companies where people had more social mobility in this sense. So it depends on many factors. So it's not only what the state can do, but also how the economic labor markets are structured, and also how the welfare systems are structured. So lots of components, but for sure, for instance, one huge debate in Europe has been the access for asylum seekers to the labor market, where in Europe it has always been assumed that this is a pull factor for migrants, and often access has been hindered, which is a huge issue for the well-being, of course, of migrants and of refugees, and for the economic well-being. So I think here there have been differences, but again, what we can see is rather in terms also of convergence and of ideas about migration and migrants, also in the global north, and how systems work there. But originally, yes, I mean, you mentioned it very rightly, two very different systems and philosophies. Also what the labor market can do and what it should do and how it should integrate newcomers.
Let's bring in some questions, because the questions are piling up, and that's how we like to see it, of course. A very engaged audience that does not just listen, but wants to pose questions. Willem Maas, Turku, is asking a question. To what extent is the turn to recognition a distraction from the real issues of redistribution? Can inequality, social exclusion, and discrimination be solved mostly by redistribution? You want to take that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and nice to see Willem Maas here, whose fantastic work on European integration has been so inspiring for my own work. Willem brings up a kind of debate that's raging among political scientists at the moment, who are seeking to come to grips with the rise of populist politics in so many different countries and so many different established democracies, as well as transitional ones. And there are sort of two main kind of extreme positions out there. You know, one that says, you know, these sorts of populist movements are a result of the are sort of a response to the socioeconomic insecurity, particularly that stems from neoliberalism and economic globalization. And another one that says, no, it's very much about recognition issues, precisely. It's very much about anxieties, about identity, about sociocultural dominance and changes in that sphere. If we sort of take the demands expressed by today's populist movements at face value, for example, the problem with something like European integration is not so much that it sort of stands in the way of a more equitable distribution of resources, but that it is eroding cultural cohesion and solidarity in the national political unit, that it poses a threat to sovereignty. So a proposal that has always been dear to the sort of supranationalist or European federalist left, which is moving some of the social welfare functions away from member states towards the EU, would be exactly the wrong kind of remedy to this sort of mobilization around identity, right? It would be it would be the wrong remedy. It would be like approaching the oil fire of identity politics with the water of greater supranational competence that takes away some of the core prerogatives of member states. So I think we are right to sort of hold on to that distinction while acknowledging that in practice, those anxieties are often very difficult to disentangle from one another.
Before I bring in Andreas and Bruno again, Leila, I know you wanted to jump in here quickly.
Thanks so much, Ali, and ciao, Willem. It's really a pleasure that you're here also. Yeah, I think that's an extremely important question I wanted to add, because often, there is also the question in public debate, are people just manipulated and do they act against their own interest when it's really about distribution and this kind and economic issues? So here I think this is often like a misconception like we have, and we have to listen more closely, because people aren't manipulated, but they have different hierarchies of values and what is important to them. And one issue is also the issue identity issues and cultural value issues. So I think this has to be taken seriously if we don't want this polarization going further and further. So I think here it's really that many people also sometimes put those values over economic values. So I think this is also, of course, both of them are important, and as also the other speakers rightly said, they are entangled. But I think it's not that easy that we can just say, okay, the one aspect is just, it's just over, shouldn't be ignored over the other. So when we think about conflicts and what is important to people and how they react.
And absolutely, and you mentioned identities, Andreas, which brings me to Massimo Amato's question, because I think it plays right into it. He says, social justice in the EU, and I'm asking you because you just, we compared the European system to the American one previously. He says, social justice in the EU is more related to integration of minorities than to economic redistribution issues. The integration of minorities mostly relates to immigration, which raises issues of religious differences and cultural differences. These challenges the identity and belonging feeling of the population. The issue is hard to tackle in the EU, and its question is the US more successful in this regard?
Well, if I may, I would like to talk about populist nationalism a little bit. That's a topic that Turku was kind of bringing in. Before I address Massimo's question, is that okay?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different view on the question of what explains populist nationalism in Europe, Eastern Europe mostly, but also in the US. So I don't think it's about identity per se and threats to identities and things like that. I think that's maybe, in my view, an overly social psychological micro kind of approach. So I think the issues are political, and I think there is real interests that are involved here. and people are not misperceiving their interests, so they're not misled by bad populist people. I think they perceive actually some of the issues that populists seek to address in quite realistic terms. And what are these issues? So the parties of the left have basically moved away from representing working class interests. That's just all over Europe and in the US. That's a phenomenon that starts in the 70s and then accelerates and so on. And so the classical social democratic working class focused positions have been abandoned towards neoliberal economic policies, European integration, global economic integration, and so on and so on. And at the same time, with the rise of identity politics on the left, multiculturalism, diversity discourse, and so on, there was also a relative symbolic degrading of members of the majority who all of a sudden don't see themselves any longer represented at the heart of the national discourse. And both the loss of economic security in the wake of neoliberal globalist integration and the loss of symbolic primacy then makes nationalist appeals, nationalist populist appeals to restore national sovereignty, to restore the primacy of working class interests to economic policymaking against bureaucratic elites, to restore primacy of members of the national working classes in the labor market against migrants from all over the world, or in the case of Europe, from all over Europe. And promises to restore the dignity of the members of the nation against this kind of cosmopolitan diversity discourse. So all of this makes a lot of sense from the point of view of the working classes who have indeed lost political representation and lost security and an economic policy making framework where their interests were actually at the center. So I think from that point of view, a more kind of political sociology analysis of what's driving these movements and taking actually the perspective of people who vote for these parties serious, it doesn't look like it's driven basically by irrational anxiety, fears related to identity issues that are completely ephemeral. Okay, so let me try to make a turn, or maybe you want to move on, Ali, or shall I address?
Indeed, because your answer, of course, is an interesting one, Bruno, and I want to bring you in here because Andreas says actually the rise of populism, of nationalism, of far-right parties in the US doesn't necessarily have to do with irrational fears, but we have seen a spike first after the Euro crisis, but particularly after the 2015 refugee crisis throughout Europe, not just in Central and Eastern countries, so Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. Those countries are often being put forth as examples, but Germany, of course, with the AfD, France, in your own country, of course, Emmanuel Macron narrowly beat out his rival. So the rise of populism and nationalism is first of all one where that is dividing and it is attacking social cohesion amongst European societies, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree on Andreas' views. I have worked myself on this, and I've called the tendency shrinking and shouting. You have the middle class made of mid-skilled workers who were very central in the Fordist era, in the 60s, who see their size and their importance in society diminishing, their prospect for jobs being eroded by both globalization and technological change. And since they are middle class, they are insiders, so they shout. They want to be recognized, and they are not marginal. They are not voiceless, so they shout. And indeed, the left, the central left, has left this kind of electorate towards you said, Andreas, neoliberalism, I don't know, at least towards the educated middle class, you know, which is one of the great winner of both globalization and automation. What is interesting in terms of redistribution is that there is, in this shouting, there is a demand for recognition, and the left, represented by Hillary Clinton, called them deplorable. So this is not a good recognition, to say the least. But they also want to have security and to have protection. And I think it is a demand for economic security, protect my job, from social security, guarantee me, and this is what we call welfare chauvinism. You know, I want welfare state, but for myself and not for the migrants, and cultural protection. So I think we shouldn't contradict the two. You want recognition and you want protection. And to come back on Willem's point, I think that you cannot redistribute correctly if you don't know to whom you want to redistribute. And you need first to recognize where are the social problems. I think that one thing which is still difficult in both Europe and the US is to recognize that the poor these days are not the elderly anymore, but are young people, single parents family. And you need first recognition of that before being able to rearrange the redistribution. So I think there are a strong connection between the notion of recognition, you know, who are the new groups, the new cleavages, the new lost, left aside, left behind, and then you can reorganize redistribution, which is not only money, as Willem says, it's also education, access to healthcare, but there are, depending on who you are, different needs, and you first need to recognize the new groups, let's say, to say the least. If I may just say something, Europe, the European institutions, I believe, have been important to promote and the right of women, men and women equality. They have done a lot. They've led to some countries to change their constitution, even like Ireland, to promote a better gender balance. I'm teaching that to my students today, and my students say, okay, gender, you know, but what about transgender? What about LGBT rights? You know, so there is always moving societies with new identities, new problems, new groups, and it's first a problem of recognition, I believe.
Turko, I know you want to respond to what Andreas has been saying.
Yeah, just really quickly, I find this exchange very helpful. I didn't mean to say that explaining support for populist movements through the sociocultural anxiety thesis is like necessarily irrational. I don't think there's anything irrational about a culturally dominant class wanting to preserve its situation of cultural predominance, right? I think that is, you know, a very rational understanding of their interests. But I also found this point about, you know, leftist parties ceasing to represent the working class, you know, being in dereliction of responsibility. I think that is a very, very important point, and I agree with that. At the same time, this new appeal to the working class is very much mediated by identity politics, because this new appeal to the working class codes the working class as members of, you know, either in a nativist way or in a racial way. For example, in the United States, where a very large proportion of the working class is made up of undocumented immigrants, you know, and people, you know, people of color, Trump's appeal to the working class is not, sorry, I think I was the first person to say Trump, so I mea culpa. But
it was inevitable.
I think so. That appeal to the working class is very much suffused with identity politics, and this is not a new thing, by the way. So the New Deal coalition was very much in spoken and unspoken ways a way for a help for white working class and left people of color out of the equation here in the U.S. So this has a long lineage.
Well, someone had to bring up Trump at some point, inevitably. And it is true, of course, the parallels are quite there. There's a segment amongst the American population that yearns for supposedly better time in the past. And you have the same tendencies, of course, in Europe as well. Leila, jump in here. We're already in the midst of the conversation. I know you wanted to add.
Yes, thanks so much. I think everything what also Bruno said, what Andreas said, what Turkuler said, all very important points. And I think they're all like really all of what we said is really like compatible with each other. So I think also this identity, what Turkuler mentioned, what I mentioned, I think in a sense it's exactly because people are not manipulated or it's irrational. But if we think of identity in the very important question, what Bruno said in terms of new cleavages, so these cosmopolitans versus the communitarians, no, like those who yearn more for sovereignist answers versus the other ones more for internationalist, supranational ones. And I think this is really important. I think here which preferences people have, and here that's also part of identity question is of course is not irrational, and that's why also what Turkuler said is really important. I just wanted to highlight these cleavages that Bruno mentioned, really important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Bruno, go right ahead.
Yeah, just to illustrate what Turkuler is saying is that currently in most countries, European countries, the debate is indeed, the answer, the political answer to what I call the lower middle class shouting is an identity answer, right? Where they speak about migration, they speak about access to benefit, these kind of things. What is surprising that you don't really see and hear a left type of answer, which is, you guys have social problems. Look at the opioid pandemic. This is right, the lower middle class voters for Trump. I say it now. You see the increasing precariousness, loss of jobs, health problems. These are social problems. What is surprising is that the left is not trying to address this group, the lower middle class, with typical or traditional left way, but as Turkuler is saying, with identity issues. And this just legitimate back the rhetoric of the right wing, the radical right rhetoric, because this is framing the debate with these terms, where you could just shift it and say, these people, they really have strong social problems, and we have perhaps some solution for you.
Andreas, we in Europe, of course, we always looked upon the United States with a degree of envy as a successful melting pot. Now, obviously, the debates, not just this year, but in previous years as well, have sort of displayed and revealed the cracks in that image. But again, looking at Europe, are we finding that social cohesion is much more difficult in a diverse, multicultural society as well, particularly with the knowledge and context that the United States has a very different founding history than the European continent does?
Yes, indeed. So that's kind of Massimo Amato's question reframed, and it's an important question. It used to be that Europeans would look at the US and say, something is really great about the US. Its openness to migration, it's accomplished, taken for granted, multiculturalism and the acceptance of diversity and so on. And of course, with the Trump election, I'm glad, Turku, that you mentioned Trump, so we can now, the door is open to our favorite subject. So with his election and everything he brought to light, there's of course more and more reasons to doubt that the US is that different with that regard from the US. And you have very strong, as Turku has mentioned, nativist strands now. Some of it even borderline, racist, racialized for sure, strands within the Republican base. So, but still, I do think that the national myth of e pluribus unum, the national myths of being a country of immigration, the idea that people from all over the world come here to succeed, and we are open to that, is making things, even if there's resistance against that interpretation of the national myth, I think it makes the work of creating an inclusionary national community easier than the national myths in Europe, which are, for historical reasons, a completely different nature. The national myths in Europe are basically directed against the neighboring countries. And there's centuries of wars between these countries that have forged these thick national identities, the idea that we, the Germans, are the ones who have been fighting the Brits and the French and so on for centuries, and the other way around. And the idea of homogeneity of language, but also of culture, is kind of built into the fabric. It's hardwired into the collective identities and into the body politics in Europe. So there's variation there too. France has it much less than, let's say, Germany. Hungary has it extremely strongly. Greece has an extraordinarily strong ethnic nationalist kind of core. Britain has it a little bit less. It conceives itself as a multilingual nation and so on. So it's complicated, but I think the overall, now I've got the name because that's disappeared from the Q&A box. Emmanuel was his name, who asked the question. I think
Massimo.
Maximo. I think the general thrust of the question that there is indeed a difference between Europe and the US, and that Europe has a certain advantage, is probably still true. And once the whole smoke of the Trump fires have disappeared, I'm using a California wildfire metaphor here, and the air has cleaned up again in 5 or 10 years or maybe 15. And I think that potential that the US society has to actually forge an inclusion, more inclusionary, open to people from all around the world, national community will become visible again.
Leila, you are at the European University Institute, and unfortunately, I don't think there is a single European country out there left without a sizable and significant far-right movements. Andreas just said the UK perhaps to a lesser degree, but let's not forget it was the anti-immigration sentiments that fueled the Brexit debate. Lega Nord in Italy, Spain unfortunately has caught the bug, Scandinavian countries, AfD, Marine Le Pen, you name it. The EU, sometimes we forget, has received the Nobel Peace Prize actually in 2012 for its promotion of democracy and human rights. But what we're seeing these days is an open outpour of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia. Do you think the EU of 2020 would stand a chance to gain the same prize as the EU received in 2012? What has gone wrong in the past 8 years? I know it's a loaded question, but one I think you're well equipped to answer.
Yeah, thanks very much for this question. And I think, again, many layers to this question in the sense that what has gone wrong. So I think the first one, we have to say, like, I think one thing that too much has put on the agenda and policies have been driven by this idea of the populist radical right, as you mentioned. But I think, and also as Andreas before mentioned, the mobilization, of course, of political entrepreneurs, of populist parties, very important. But I think, again, you mentioned anti-migration sentiment. It's not that easy, it's much, much more nuanced. So when we look actually at the data, at public opinion data, so what we see, and we see this is even much more nuanced in the United States, but it's not that there is all fierce anti-migrant people out there. So basically in many European states, we even see that public opinion about migration becomes more favorable. So there is also this, or it's relatively stable, and it also depends, and it's very nuanced. So it's not that the majority of people is anti-migrant in Europe. This is simply not the case. So there is lots of middle segments or different middles, so to say, like who might be concerned about certain issues, but who are not anti-migrant. And then it depends also what they are concerned about. Is it irregular migration? Is it labor migration? So basically, the most concern is about irregular migration, and this has been an issue that has been very salient and mobilized by certain political entrepreneurs. That's the same like in the United States. But I think this idea, which has very much also pushed political elites in the European Union, this idea that the European citizens are anti-migrant, I think this has set very much the agenda and the power also of certain political entrepreneurs, but it doesn't represent really the totality of what people think and how they feel. And I think also somebody mentioned now before that now the salience of migration, of course, is less with COVID-19, with the pandemic. So we speak much less about migration, which opens also up the space again to let that political decision makers are less pushed or less haunted by this idea that there is so much anti-migration sentiment. But I think first we have to start with this, that demystify this idea that it's much more nuanced than we often believe. Yeah.
Bruno, interestingly enough, and you mentioned recognition, there seems to be a perplexed, if not contradictory situation. On one hand, we talked about the fuel, if you will, that drives the far-rightist movements, people who feel left out of the political discourse, who feel that their voices are not heard. But on the other side, you have people with a migrant background who are complaining of a lack of social inclusion, a lack of diversity in all walks of life. That, of course, is also applicable to gender. Many women, and rightly so, feel left out when it comes to promotion in the workplace and so on and so forth. So what we have is a potent, if not poisonous mix, because we're talking about social justice and social cohesion, of many people from all different walks of life, often with contradictory points of view, but they have one thing in common: they feel left out. Whose shortcoming is this, and how to fix this?
Oh, how to fix it is very complicated. I think one of the big trend which is pushing these developments in both the US and Europe is what we call labor market polarization. What kind of jobs have been created over the last 20 or 30 years? A lot of well-paid, high-skilled jobs. These are the winners. This is the highly educated people, us and our students, if you wish, the Columbia alumni. They are the winners of economic integration, of automation, etc. And they are still running the show, in a way you cannot do without them. And then you have another group which is losing ground, the one I was speaking about, the mid-skilled people who were central, and we need them less, if you wish, in manufacturing and the kind of things, but also, computers can replace them, and these are the ones who are shouting. And then you have, on the other hand of the paycheck, if you wish, you have a rising number of precarious, supposedly low-skilled services who are occupied by migrants, people of migrant origin, women, low-skilled, low-educated people. And these, in our societies, are supposed to be non-productive people, and the bad jobs and the bad pay are made for them. And these people, they have difficulties to be heard because they are not composed as a class yet, I would say. I think it's the proletariat of the service economy, but it's not recognized there. A lot of them either don't vote, there is a lot of abstention amongst the low-skilled poor population, or do not have access to vote because they are migrants. So they don't represent an electoral sign. To my view, what is interesting is that they have been extremely visible during the lockdown. This is what is called the essential. The people working in education, in care, in healthcare, but also in transportation, in logistics, in the sectors. And there is a contradiction in our world where we call them essential and we reserve them very bad social and situation. Low pay, and economists call them low-skilled jobs, low-skilled, non-productive jobs when they are essential. And I think this may drive a change because, as we said, COVID brings migration less on the top. Also, COVID has really eroded the credibility of anti-EU parties. In Italy, it's very visible. Salvini has problems now in being an anti-EU. This is what polls, Maurizio Ferreira, Leila told me and showed me data about that. It has decreased over the few weeks because it's more difficult to be against Europe in various countries. So there may be a change thanks to this crisis, even though it's a difficult moment of recognition of new work. Services to others is very key. but we should value them on their right. And this is, of course, a question not only of social justice, but of political stability.
The questions are piling up in the Q&A forum. I encourage also our speakers to have a look, because not every question might be suited to their interests or expertise. One question that I want to throw out there, Turko, Andreas, Leila, whoever wants to take it, is when we talk about social justice in Europe, we've already agreed that Europe is a very diverse continent made up of formerly 28, now 27 nations. Which countries would you say are leading when it comes to social justice in a positive context? Which countries are performing particularly well on the fields, on the front of social justice? Andreas, you want to take that?
Well, here my hidden Swiss nationalism, I'm afraid, will break into the open, and so I will say that that Switzerland has done actually extraordinarily well, and for a variety of reasons, some of which are specific, but others, there's some policy choices that Switzerland made that could travel to other parts as well. So the difference between the highest income earner and the lowest income earner has been relatively stable, and the economic growth of the last 15, 20 years has benefited both, not to the same degree, but compared to other countries, let alone in Europe, let alone the US, you could say that the working classes have profited from economic growth to a far larger degree than elsewhere. So I think that's relatively successful. We talked about immigrant integration. You had a conversation, Ali, with Leila about that. And if you look at social mobility in the second generation, which is of course the indicator of openness. So do the children of largely working class immigrants, do they make it into college? Do they make it into non-working class, middle class professions? If you look at that from a comparative point of view, Switzerland has done extraordinarily well as well. Certainly better than Germany and other places in Europe. So that's a relatively good model. I think there's a lot to be said for the German model in certain aspects of it, at least. It doesn't do that well in terms of immigrant mobility, as I said, which has largely to do with the structure of the educational system and how people are very early in their age, put on tracks that either lead to apprenticeships or lead to college. The opposite of the French model, as it were, where lots more people go to college. And so Germany hasn't done well on that end, but when it comes to distributing the benefits of growth over the different parts of society, it has done better than other kind of societies, I think. So there's different, depending on what you mean by social justice, exactly whether it's immigrant integration or whether it is class with a classical redistributive class oriented perspective. Different countries lend themselves as models. When it comes to the newer identity politics questions that Turkuler has talked about very early on, recognition questions, then I think there would yet be other countries that have done better. Maybe the UK has done better, has an easier time also in pluralizing its own understanding what it means to be British, and compared to the convulsions of that in France, the painful kind of discussions that you have in France with this whole the Republican model, not to be understood in the American sense of the term Republican, which makes these discussions and the pluralization of the national narrative much more difficult. And Germany has its own, difficulties with that. So depending on what dimension of social justice you look at, I think different country models recommend themselves.
Absolutely. And first of all, your plug for Switzerland is very much is very much welcomed. So now all we need to do is convince and persuade Switzerland to join the European Union. But I think that's a different debate and would exceed our time here for sure. Leila, I know you wanted to quickly add to what Andreas said, and then Turko, I want to give you a chance to talk specifically about what Bruno has been touching about, namely the impact of the COVID crisis on the EU.
I think it's really, I mean, we often mention here now that Europe, of course, is very diverse. It's like 27 or 28 countries, depending on how you see now the status of the UK. So the European Union countries. But I think I want to make it even more complicated. And I think it's really, really important because there is no national models. So in the 90s, or we always thought there is different national models, different, and these typical trajectories. It's much more, again, much more nuanced in the sense that it depends in which sector. So it depends labor market, social, like welfare issues. So there is lots of different models even within a country. So I think this is really crucial. And then also, of course, different actors, different interests in this sense. So I think we really have to look in these perspectives as well. So it's much more when it comes really to inclusion, it's these different policies in these different sectors which really matters, rather than some kind of abstract national philosophies which don't really like structure then policies or inclusion. And I think one thing I wanted to add, which we still haven't picked up when it comes about social inclusion, policies are rightly very important. We have to look at them, but also how much is also, again, like, and this is a much more the idea of interaction and contact between people. And I think this is also an issue which now in the United States came up a lot, but also, of course, an issue in Europe. It's about when it's about segregation and people not meeting and not interacting with each other. I mean, Allport in 1945, if I'm not mistaken, like established his contact theory, and lots of sociologists after him tried to test his thesis, and they proved it right and right and right again. So basically what Allport says, in order to reduce prejudice, people have to meet each other, but they have to meet each other in terms of meaningful contacts. So they have to force friendships, they have to work together, not just passing by each other at the streets. And I think also we have to ask ourselves in which cities, in which localities. So here it's not only about countries, in which places people get the chance to meet each other and to have meaningful contact, so that also these ideas, racialized ideas and forms of inclusion and prejudice can diminish. This was just one point I really also wanted to bring in. So much more localized, much more different paths, so no national paths. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think by now that we're 60 minutes into this very lively debate, I think it's become abundantly clear to everyone that the term social justice is, of course, such a loaded one, such a general one, that you can sort of bring it and tear it into very different directions. And I think that's what makes this debate so interesting, because it is so multi-layered. And I think if we discuss for another 4 or 5 hours, we still necessarily wouldn't agree on one particular definition on what social justice means. It means many things depending also on whom you're asking, but I think that's what makes this debate so rich and educational. Turko, Bruno talked a little bit about the impact of the COVID crisis on the EU. I know you wanted to follow up on that.
Yeah, and also to respond to your question about, which national model. And one of the things to consider, I think, is that the whole idea of, the diversity of national models faces some pretty strict constraints as a result of the European Union's economic and in particular monetary union. So perhaps it's no coincidence that, Switzerland has been able to go a different way and achieve effective results, precisely perhaps because it's not in the EU. I mean, obviously a lot of the EU rules apply to Switzerland. Switzerland has taken on those obligations voluntarily. prematurely. But I wanted to talk about some ways in which the COVID crisis might actually be straining those very rules, in particular fiscal and budgetary rules that member states have been under for the past few decades. So Andreas pointed out, I think at the very beginning, that the pandemic has reminded us of the extent to which we rely on the provision of essential services by states, right? It turns out that we really need publicly funded healthcare provision. It turns out that we need a robust social safety net, in the event of sort of cataclysmic economic crises for citizens and businesses alike, and we need scientific research. So in this respect, the COVID crisis has brought some strains on the EU's permanent austerity regime that has been itself really hemming in member states' ability to provide essential goods to their citizens. That regime was strengthened and further entrenched during the Eurozone crisis. And I do think that the EU's single most dramatic impact on social justice remains through fiscal and budgetary constraints on member states, particularly those in the Eurozone. So before the pandemic, the Commission was already making noises about the need to make changes to the application of the Stability and Growth Pact. And as soon as the pandemic hit, its rules were suspended. So the Commission has said that it's not going to initiate new excessive deficit procedures against member states. I think right now all Euro area countries have larger budget deficits than 3%. Of course, the national packages that have been adopted in response to the pandemic vary a lot. What will be the long-term effect of these trends? I mean, that's something that I'm really curious to see. Are they going to be normalized? The conventional wisdom in political science tends to be that political measures taken during emergencies sometimes get normalized over time. So one wonders when and how the EU will be able to reel these policies back into line. I have no illusions. I think the existing fiscal discipline regime is going to die hard. We have seen the frugal member states tying, the disbursement of recovery funds to certain conditions. So rhetoric aside, I'm not sure that the pandemic has created a sort of we're all in this together mentality among member states. I think some of the divisions are alive and well. So this is something that I'm going to be watching closely to see what the long-term effects will be.
Indeed, as will we. And you're absolutely right. If you look at the haggling and hard negotiations and bargains that have been taking place in Brussels over the EU relief funds, indeed, it is hard to argue that the pandemic has brought Europe closer together. And Bruno, as a matter of fact, with the looming economic crisis and expected recession, the impact that COVID will have on social justice and social cohesion on the EU, but also within European societies, the prognosis is probably not necessarily a positive one in the short term, is it?
Yeah, what is interesting is that out of the financial crisis, there has been more stringent rules, as Turku said, and we could say that the German model was dominating, and Germany wanted to impose austerity to Southern Europe so that they became either exporting countries or at least not consuming too much. And this was the rules, and there was a strong north-south cleavage out of this period. What is interesting is that Germany, and it's really Angela Merkel and Germans have realized that they couldn't reproduce the same cleavage after the COVID, because you couldn't have a more condemnation of Southern Europe. It's not their fault, it's a virus, because they realized that it would endanger the whole Europe and the German economy if they did the same. So they have changed their position towards a much more sharing position in terms of sharing the debt, etc. The problem is that it was about to solve the north-south cleavage, but now we are facing a new one, which is the east-west cleavage. Eastern countries, they don't want to be obliged to respect the, the liberal democracy. They want to be illiberal democracy. They don't want to be open to migration, etc. And it's a new cleavage that emerged from the COVID crisis, which prevent this new vision to be adopted in various countries. So we move from one crisis to the other one, but that's the traditional history of Europe. And I think this is a good news that Germany has really changed the stance with the same actors. Merkel, Schäuble also said, yes, we have to do something. So this is quite an achievement, but there is always a new obstacle to things. What I find a little bit disappointing is that some countries are not strong enough on their values, especially on the human rights, social rights, these kind of things. They have some bargaining power. If you want the EU money, you should apply, and they hesitate to do these kind of things, and perhaps it could be stronger. If I may say one word about the countries, just to remind Andreas that from a female point of view, Switzerland is not really a great country. You have huge gender inequalities. Should I remind you that one canton in your country adopted the vote for women only in 1994, but also the access to the labor market for women is not that great. So it all depends on what we define as social justice. And here again, I would bring not France, but I would bring the Nordic countries as the exemplar countries as far as equality is concerned. But since things are always complex, they are very egalitarian, but also are facing and confronted with raising xenophobic movement, with here again, the left not knowing what to do. In Denmark, the left has decided to go on anti-migrant decisions, which are actually illegal as the European point of view, because they put some limitation to access to social rights to EU members, citizens. So this is strange. But as far as equality within the country is concerned, they are very high, I would say, in terms of social model. But they have problems with migration, and they are confronted with that.
Well, we have approximately 15 minutes left already. Time is flying, especially when you have so much great and educational input from four wonderful speakers. I want to devote some time to the questions in the forum. I know they're all over the place, so it's going to be it's not going to be easy to sort of string them all together, but rather throw a few of them out. Ayşe Kadıoğlu is asking, could it be that the incumbent governments in some countries in Europe, more specifically Hungary and Poland, have more in common with the US government in terms of an enhancement of the powers of the executive branch of government? How is that development related to issues of social justice? Bruno, you already alluded to the rise of illiberal democracies and those who unfortunately have a different understanding of the term solidarity. They're more than happy to reap the benefits of being an EU member financially, but when it comes to burden sharing, such as on the issue of refugees, they sort of duck away, Leila. It's a problem that Europe cannot properly deal with and sanction. It's somewhat frustrating for some, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, you speak now about the solidarity when it comes to refugees, yes, but also this is part of the problem, how the common European asylum system is designed. Already from its establishment, I mean, with the Dublin regulation, which is really the cornerstone. So the Dublin regulation regulates that the first country an asylum seeker enters there, this country is responsible for the asylum process. So I think already this is like a solidarity averse, like everybody on his own system. I think so. It's already enshrined in the system as such. And I think also very, very important what Bruno said about this, exactly this trend versus illiberal democracy, so still democracies, but in its illiberal fashion versus countries that more on the still hold on the liberal side. So I think yes, but again, as you see, like it's already enshrined, and this how to solve this and come out of this deadlock and in these new conflicts which divide Europe. I mean, because basically it really here everybody fends on his own. So it's not even big camps, but it's really like the countries are like all acting in their own interests. So I think that's also like a huge challenge for Europe, if not one of the biggest, and for sure will come up again. But I also wanted to say, like in terms of East, West, North, South, I think it's also extremely interesting that all conflicts come up again. And I just want to mention the UK example, because in the UK now there is new measures in the north. So I think many people and mayors and also local politicians, now they are protesting and they say, okay, this again is this historic conflict that the rich south, so the rich center versus us in the north. So I think this is also extremely interesting, and where you can see that these new conflicts pick up on historic conflicts and vulnerabilities, and we have to be very sensitive also about this, how governments communicate and how they deal with COVID and the consequences. So I just to make things again more complex, that it's also within countries, you see also these old cleavages or old conflicts breaking up.
That is quite all right. I think whenever you are entitling a series, The Future of Europe, I think anything goes. I think all layers have to be spelled out. As a matter of fact, this is just the first of many discussions that will be played out amongst the next few weeks and months, where many of the issues that we inevitably have been touching upon, European identity, solidarity, EU-US relations, all of those, of course, will come up in more detail. Andreas, as time is sort of closing down, let's try to bring somewhat of a closure and conclusion, if you will, as difficult as it may be, to today's discussion. The question, of course, is how can Europe achieve social justice, implying that it is lacking in many ways, and I think that's already been confirmed by our discussion today. If you were asked to advise the European Union and some European countries in particular on the issue of social justice, what would be your number 1, 2, 3 priorities here?
Well, I would kind of continue with the exercise that we started and look at, with apologies to Leila, to national models that for certain kind of policy sectors work really well. Gender equality, Bruno, thank you for pointing that out, that this is really the Nordics are always the El Dorado for everything that has to do with gender. Maybe there's elements of the Swiss model, there's elements of Germany, and so on, that could be combined as models of how, in a difficult situation with major challenges brought about by COVID, but also by the rise of anti-European parties, models that could guide the European Union's march into the future. But if I may, I would then also recommend to the European Union something that it might not want to hear, which is the issue of political justice. The European Union has what a lot of people have pointed out, a deficit in democracy. But actually, this is an issue that I think sooner or later will have to be addressed in much more substantial ways than just giving a little bit more power to a dysfunctional European Parliament. You know, the whole construction of the European Union, the common currency, the enlargement to the east that opened up the labor markets on the west to millions and millions of people, all of these massively consequential decisions for everyday people have been taken without any democratic backing of these. So the European Union continues to be an elite project, initially largely driven by political concerns. Let's not have a third world war breaking out in our continent, but then it became a technocratic growth, big corporations driven project, and with some additional ideas about political stability and so on. So unless Europe can make a democratic turn and actually base its major policy decisions on popular will, I think it will see continuation of European parties proliferating in different parts, gaining power here and there. It will see more Brexits. It will basically face challenges. I'm thinking now in generational terms, you know, maybe not tomorrow, but in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, it will face challenges that it will not be able to face.
Turku, Andreas, of course, brings up a very interesting point, one that is widely discussed on the continent, in that I think no one disputes that the European Union is one of the, if not the most successful political projects of the 20th century, in that it has brought peace to a continent that has lacked peace and has seen destruction and war for far too long. But has it overextended itself? And Gabriel Zimmermann whose question is sort of playing into that, namely, all these extensive spending and transfers within the EU, have all the actions on the part of the EU backfired and revived and created right-wing populist movements in the first place? In other words, coming back to Andreas' question, does Europe sort of have to recheck itself and go back to the basics? What do you think?
I think the EU finds itself in a pretty unenviable dilemma, which is that some of the social justice issues that we're talking about stem from the EU's own enforcement of market discipline over decades. Likewise with immigration, right? Immigration issues were not created by the EU's regime of free movement, but they really make, you know, refugee flows an issue of concern for all member states. But for the EU to take the reins and address these questions, so let me take social justice, you know, a distributive justice as my example, because that's what I've been talking about in this panel. So to acquire a significant role in social welfare provision, the EU would have to have greater fiscal resources and greater powers, which, as I said at the beginning, would really further inflame populist nativist movements within member states and the sort of general democratic malaise that citizens legitimately feel in delegating powers to a political unit whose leaders they cannot directly elect or dismiss by electoral means, this democratic deficit that Andreas was pointing out. And furthermore, for the EU to acquire greater financial resources in order to address issues of social marginalization, unemployment, et cetera, would mean, you know, the EU doesn't administer its own projects itself. It hands out these resources to member states. And so for the EU to be forking over more euros to some member states that don't even, no longer even pretend to follow the EU's political values and to uphold the basics of constitutional democracy would be quite counterproductive. And to come back to something that Bruno mentioned earlier, the EU's individuated benefits have for a very long time flowed rather to elites, right? So who took advantage of free movement rights? It was largely sort of people who were already educated, who spoke another language, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, working classes did also, but these gains were not distributed in a sort of even fashion. The EU, I'm not saying that the EU hasn't benefited people in the poorer areas. Of course it has, through cohesion funds, right, through the common agricultural policy and so on. But these are not individuated rights or benefits. So it's difficult for citizens to perceive these benefits when they are accruing to them. So these are all some really difficult problems that have to do with European integration. They're not the creation of European integration, but it is difficult for the EU to address them in a way that would entail demanding more powers for an entity that's not perceived as being democratically accountable.
So in many ways, ironically and tragically, if you will, the EU has become somewhat of a victim of its own success.
Precisely.
Bruno, Leila, Turko, and Andreas, we are 5 minutes away from closing this discussion. Let me just end with one simple question and be mindful of the restricted time that is left. Bruno, the question, of course, that Colombia has given for us to answer today is and was, how can Europe achieve social justice? You're all people who are looking beyond their own horizon, beyond the European horizon. Does Europe still, and can Europe still serve as a role model globally when it comes to social justice, despite all the difficulties and shortcomings that we have pointed out throughout today's discussion? Bruno.
One of the challenges whether social justice within Europe is made at the expense of other countries, and this is true for redistribution. Do we share amongst ourselves or with others? This is true for the climate change. Are we becoming no carbon emission economics at the expense of the South? This is the kind of thing. So we may find solutions that are good for ourselves, but which means that we increase inequalities with the rest of the world, and this is one of the big challenge. And Europe has performed quite well so far, but with having a colonial history, with having neglect of the South, and one of the challenges is whether Europe remain good for its members or whether it becomes a role model in a more integrated, more interdependent world because of the climate change, because of not only globalization, but also that our fate depends on the other ones.
Leila, on social justice, Europe, role model?
Oh, again, a very tough question, but very short. I think we should always be skeptical about role models in general. And I think also Bruno answered perfectly also to this. And I think, isn't it also a bit Eurocentric, like to think of Europe as a role model? No, we have always, like Europe itself has always put itself up there. But it's the question, like, is there a model that other regions follow? And I doubt so. Like, I think they are all very specific. There is regional solutions because there is regional challenges. So yeah, but I keep it there for the being skeptical about the role model.
Andreas, we all know that Europe is not shy about lecturing other regions in the world, oftentimes on issues like human rights, on social justice, on democracy. In the year 2020, does Europe still hold up and can justify that role as the global conscience that it likes to see itself oftentimes?
Well, I think the time for humility has come, maybe for everybody around the world. Depending on what sector you look at, there's other role models out there. If you want to have a really good public service sector that delivers public goods, then go to Singapore. If you want to have, on the policymaking perspective, a good model of how to deal with COVID, then go to Korea. If you want to have a society that is large and industrialized and globally integrated, but where social inequalities don't explode, then go to Japan. So there's lots of different parts around the world where things are done right. But I do believe that Europe, when it comes to social inclusion, to welfare, and to supranational policymaking, is indeed still doing quite well. It's the only place in the world where different countries that have a very conflictual history with each other actually do something like shared policymaking. That is very, very unusual. And I think that is the promise that is unique to Europe, not so much in other policymaking fields, but in international cooperation, voluntary cooperation, mostly. It is a model that is quite unique and maybe holds some promise still for the rest of the world.
Turko, role model or not, the European Union, when it comes to social justice? Do you think the continent and the 27 nations are trendsetting, are leading the field in the global context, or is it time for humility, as Andreas is pointing out?
Look, for all the reasons that Andreas said, I hope the EU makes it. And for the reason that, like, I work on the EU, so I hope it sticks around. But I think, you know, Leila is absolutely right. I hope the EU makes it, but I hope others do better. I hope there are fairer and more democratic experiments in transnational governance.
I hope Europe makes it. I think that's a perfect segue to the conclusion. I think you echoed all our sentiments. I think we all hope that Europe makes it, but the issue and the continent, I think that much has become clear throughout the 90-minute discussion, is certainly in danger on some fronts. Certainly, this is also why Columbia University has decided to put on this series, The Future of Europe, posing the question, leading it off with how can Europe achieve social justice? I think I speak for all our participants and audience members, whom I want to thank, of course, for their active participation, their questions, and their engagement. I think I speak for all of them when I say this has been a fascinating, very content-rich and thought-provoking debate. Leila, Hadj, Abdou, Turkuler Isiksel, Bruno Palier, and Andreas Wimmer, thank you so much for your insights. It's been a pleasure moderating this debate. And so we're going to end it the way we started it, namely with Emmanuel Kattan leading the way. Emmanuel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ali. This has been a fascinating and inspiring discussion. And it reminded me, listening to all of you, of Fareed Zakaria's quip in his latest book about the American dream. He said, the American dream is not dead, but if you want to find it, you have to go to Denmark. This has been a really, really profoundly illuminating debate. I'd like, on behalf of my colleagues at the Columbia Global Centers Paris and the European Institute, as well as the Alliance Program, I'd like to thank our audience for your engagement, your fascinating questions, and your engaged participation in today's debate. I'd like to thank, of course, our panelists, Andreas Wimmer, Leila, Hadj, Abdou, Bruno Palier, Turkuler Isiksel from Columbia University, and of course our moderator, Ali Aslan. I'd like also to, and of course, if you want to thank our panel, feel free to express your appreciation by clicking on the clap icon on your screen. I'd like also to thank our co-sponsors, the Columbia Alumni Association, the Columbia Maison Française, the University Libraries at Columbia, the Institute of Ideas and Imagination, the European Legal Studies Center at Columbia Law School, Le Grand Continent, Erasmus Plus program, and the advisory board of the Paris Global Center. And then finally, our next theme will be a post-election discussion. Are Europe and America drifting apart? This will be addressed in two events. The first one will be held on November 10th. This will be a dialogue between Thierry Grillet, who will be interviewing Benoît Peters. This will be in French at 1 p.m. New York time, 7 p.m. Paris time. And the second event will be on November 17th, also at 1 p.m. New York time, 7 p.m. Paris time. It will feature a panel comprising of Célia Belin of the Brookings Institute, Sherry Berman at Barnard, Jack Snyder at Columbia, Pierre Vimont, the former French ambassador to the US, and it will be moderated by the New York Times Paris bureau chief, Roger Cohen. Please join us for these events. Don't forget to register. And in the meantime, stay safe and be well. Thank you again.